This week on The Futurists.
As bad as 2023 is now, this is the best that it's ever going to be from now on.
Welcome to The Futurists. I'm your host, Brett King, and this week I'm in Bangkok, Thailand for New Year's with my son Thomas, and caught up with a good mate of mine, Paul Ark. He's a American Thai futurist based in Thailand, and he wouldn't probably call himself a futurist, but he definitely is. And he is also in the venture capital space in clean tech, renewable tech, green tech. So Paul Ark, welcome to The Futurists.
Thank you very much for having me, Brett. We've been talking about this for a while.
We have. Now, I know, so I introduced you as a futurist because I've always known you as a futurist, thinking about the future. We've had some amazing conversations in the past about things. In fact, we did an event together, which was was it a workshop or a panel with TechSource virtually, which was on what the 22nd century was going to be like. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. That was, what was it? That was like something for Clubhouse? Was that?
Yeah.
We just had a conversation. We were just shooting the breeze about just weird. You know, I think it was one of those things that when TechSauce arranged it, it would be kind of this curated thing, and they'd have a moderator. And then as soon as we just started chatting, it was just
we just moderated each other.
They were good enough to just stay quiet and let us talk for an hour, and then they said, "Okay, that's it.
Okay, time. Otherwise, you'll go on for 3 weeks."
Yeah, absolutely.
So that is definitely the way. You know, Thailand's an interesting place. Obviously, you grew up in the States, right?
Yeah. Born and raised, but I've been living in Asia for about 30 years now.
Right, so for people that aren't aware of your background, of course, you spent a fair bit of time at Apple working on their retail presence across Asia. So choosing retail locations for Apple stores around the world, that's a pretty cool job.
That was an interesting moment in my life. I've had a lot of different careers, so when I think about Apple, that was well over a decade ago. Yeah. So it's just one of those things where
it's part of the kaleidoscope.
One of my many past lives.
Yeah, fair enough. It's cool to sort of have that background. And you've been in Thailand for how long?
This is my third time living in Thailand in the longest stretch. So I've been in Asia for 30 years. I lived in Thailand for probably the first time I moved here was probably about 3 years. And then I think the second time I moved here was probably another 3 years. And then I moved back here from mainland China in 2015, and I've been here since.
And were you in Beijing or Shanghai, or where were you in China?
Yes and yes. And yes, because I worked in real estate at the time, I was spending a lot of time on the road.
Right.
So nominally, I was based in Shanghai first, and then Beijing, and then Shanghai. But pretty much spending time in probably about a dozen and a half cities on a regular basis.
So what appeals to you about Asia at the moment in terms of economic cycles, in terms of just generally the opportunities here?
Well, it's an interesting question because it's not so much like, I'm here because of economic. Like, I've lived here, I've been here for a while. I actually moved out here because I want to be with my wife, who's here, so it's I'm in Asia for the long haul. But what I think is quite interesting, I first moved to Thailand in '94, and this is just as the Asian boom was taking off, soon to be followed by the Asian financial crisis. But back then, people were saying, this is Southeast Asia's time. Like it's on this trajectory. It's on the second stage of the rocket booster, and it's taken off. And the funny thing is where Southeast Asia now, in terms of its momentum and growth and development, is probably what folks had in mind back in the late 90s. Because I think Southeast Asia's growth spurt was very short-lived, and it wasn't that sustained. And then I think it set back a lot of the economies, both politically and economically, for years. But now, if we look at where Southeast Asia's been, maybe in the last 10 years, probably at the beginning of this whole tech cycle, it's actually been a period of sustained growth, China's kind of went through its period of development, and so I think when people were talking about Southeast Asian growth the first time around, they didn't anticipate that China would boom as much as it did, and India for that matter. So as soon as it did, then it's like, Southeast Asia where? It's because everyone was so focused on China and India. Now that China and India have kind of gone through, their kind of inflection points in the S curve. Now people are like, okay, there's Southeast Asia. Now we're ready to start pouring money in, and we'll start seeing where economic growth is going. Probably a lot more politically stable in the region than it was, 20 some years ago.
Yeah.
So no.
I think that's generally the case. I mean, we make a big fuss about China and Taiwan and the South China Sea and so forth, but actually, from a historical perspective, at least the last 120 years, it's much more stable here than it's been for a while, right?
Yeah. No, so I would say, the vision of Southeast Asia in 2023 is what I think folks were expecting back in 94, 95.
Yeah.
So it's finally here. It's it's the South the Southeast Asian era is finally here. It's just maybe 25 years a little bit tardy.
So one of the things we like to do on the show, and this is certainly applicable in your case, is look at forecasting methodologies, and you are in the business now of trying to pick winners from a venture capital perspective. And so I want to talk about that methodology and how you select, and your thesis, because you've created a new fund. But before that, let's talk about the methodology of how you choose an Apple store in a city like Guangzhou or in Singapore or places like this. In terms of long-term planning, because Apple is not going to invest in a store for just a few years and see how it goes, right? How do you go through the process of selecting a location that is going to have the longevity for a brand like Apple?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I mean, I came up in retail at a time when e-commerce was just starting to take off, but I think Apple retail, even though they are a very, very, I don't want to say capable because it understates it. They're very good at omnichannel. But, the folks on the retail side are very much traditional bricks and mortar retail. At least those of us that actually opened up the stores. And a lot of our location analysis techniques are very steeped in traditional retail concepts, which is basically foot traffic, catchment areas, demographics. Anyone that's opened up retail stores will understand the language. But it's always, just identifying, which cities, which neighborhoods have the type of demographic profile of the customers that you're looking for. And then basically understanding, based on the format of your store. If I open a store here, what is my catchment area? Basically, where is the bulk of my customers coming from? Beyond those that might be like tourists or out-of-towners, because you need that sort of local customer base. And so, if you're like a 7-Eleven, you're probably looking at a catchment area of just, maybe a few hundred meters. Or if you're in Thailand, it's probably just as far as, until you hit the 7-Eleven across the street. The catchment areas can be quite small and dense. If you talk about, say, an Apple flagship store, the catchment areas can be quite broad. For the longest time, you had, maybe 3 or 4 humongous Apple stores serving the entire New York metropolitan area. And each of them was doing, just bang up business. Just phenomenal business. So, when I was doing retail, we did a lot of analysis on, okay, what's our expected catchment? How many customers are we going to have within, say, we could either look at catchment in terms of physical distance, so, a 3-kilometer catchment area, or driving time. So, how many customers are within 15 minutes of driving time. So the interesting thing about Apple stores is when we first started opening them in China, we went in knowing that, there were a lot of Apple product that was being sold in China through resellers. Either the Apple premium resellers, the APRs, or just standard resellers, which are the notch below that didn't have as much marketing support. But we knew that any store that we opened, any flagship store that we opened, would absolutely decimate the sales of any reseller within a 2-kilometer radius.
Right.
Because people were like, there's just no point in going. Unless phones were in very short supply and people were scrounging around for other retail store locations. So, and we saw that, across the board. We saw that in Beijing when we opened up there. A lot of the resellers that I used to go to in Hong Kong before I joined Apple, once I opened up stores there, my favorite resellers weren't there anymore because we literally opened up in the same mall. So yeah, it was just really understanding, where our key markets were. China was incredibly difficult because those cities grow so fast.
Yeah.
China is one of those places where it could be a city of like 2 million people one day, and then 3 years later, it's like tripled in size.
Yeah.
And that's not even hyperbolic. That's actually what happened.
Now, I don't think a lot of our listeners, particularly those based in the US, realize the incredible amount of growth that's happened in China over the last 30 years.
And China was a weird anomaly because when Apple was first looking at the market, and our senior executives in the US are like, okay, can we get like a rundown of all the cities in China that have at least 1 million people? And I said, that's going to take a long time. There's 120 cities with over 1 million people, and that just blew their minds because they come from the U.S. 1 million person market is a major metropolis. In China, that's like a quaint little hamlet,
little village.
And so then they said, okay, how about 2 million? And like, okay, that brings it down to about 50. So it's like, if you want like detailed analysis, then give me like 6 months. And they're like, okay, how about, so
10 million.
They said, so what's the threshold if we want to look at, say, 10 cities? And I said, okay, 4 to 6 million.
Yeah.
And it just blew their mind. Okay, if we want to look at the top 20 cities, we're looking at a minimum market of 4 to 6 million. And that was just mind-blowing to them. And then it meant it's like, where in the city do we go? Because if we're looking at cities like Guangzhou, or not Guangzhou, but Chongqing, Shanghai, these are cities of like, 15, 20 million people.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's like, that's like a
it's the population of Australia.
Yeah.
Right? It's like one city. So, but yeah, I mean, there are cities that have that population, Sao Paulo and others, but it's in China, it's scary how many of them are. Okay, so now let's talk about your career shift and why you, decided to go down the route of sustainability and climate resilience and so forth. So, from my observation, being that we're friends on Facebook and we're friends IRL, I watched you go through a period of really voracious learning, doing a bunch of courses on AI and climate and green tech. And of course you led, how we met, of course, was when you were at CM Commercial Bank running their venture capital arm.
Yeah.
And from there you went on to Gobi Partners, or there was somewhere in between that, right?
No, that was it.
Gobi.
You got that right.
Yeah. And then when the pandemic came along, you did do a bunch of work and progress on yourself, sort of expanding your horizon.
Yeah, I mean, I slightly flipped there because it was all the. So I mean, well, I guess to sort of pick up from your question, yeah. So I mean, I spent 4 years doing fintech, deep tech investments for Siam Commercial Bank's Bank CVC fund, which was also kind of fun because it allowed me to start flexing some of the futurist muscles that, I think very, very few VCs really ever, like VCs are, supposed to be investing in future tech. Most of them don't.
Right.
Most of them just say whatever is the hot, tech of the moment. And I don't think they spend a lot of time looking beyond sort of the fund cycle. So like what's going to be...
We had Pablos Holman on. I don't know if you know Pablos, but Pablos is doing... space-based energy systems, microwave energy systems. He's doing vertical farming stuff, all really futuristic stuff right on the edge. But as you say, I know a lot of VCs, and you two are the only that I know that I would consider futurists.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a lot of the work I did on the fintech side was less about, okay, we're going to invest in specific financial technologies. And I actually kind of pushed my team to say, what does the world look like in 30 years? And not like super science fiction-y, but what does it reasonably look like? And, I'd asked them to look at like films like, like Minority Report, those that are kind of futuristic, but not,
but not in
spasmodically, fantastically, psychedelically.
Yeah, not set so far in the future that you can't sort of see the current world in that. Yeah.
Like, I wanted kind of near future type of experience where people would say, yeah, that would totally make sense. And I wanted them to kind of imagine scenarios like that and say, well, how do people do transactions? How do they do banking? How do they interact? Do they need banking? What does that type of service look like? And then we would come up with scenarios and start selecting like what seems like the most realistic vision. And then we would walk back the technologies 30 years and say, okay, if that seems like a reasonably good vision of the future and how people might either transact or, accumulate wealth or store their wealth or spend their wealth, then let's walk it back a bit. So if that's the way people are going to do, if that's the way people are going to purchase goods in, say, the movie Ready Player One, with the VR goggles and the drone delivery,
gesture-based wallet system,
where they showed the drones delivering pizzas and he's ordering, so it's like, okay, so
that's all pretty realistic given where we see investment going.
Yeah, and like Amazon was doing drone delivery, Tesla a little while ago, and so if we said that's kind of what people are, if that's a reasonable vision of the future, then we should walk it back and say, what are the technologies that are critical today?
Yeah.
Much like if anyone, just because anyone who grew up in Star Trek, in the 60s are going to create flip phones in the 90s.
And replicators, nanotech, right?
So I mean, I think that's where I started thinking about doing that. And then after I came out of fintech and going into the pandemic, that's when I had a lot of time to say, okay, I'm not working at the moment. I want to kind of reorient myself and start going down the path of some areas that I didn't have full reign to do when I was working for a bank. So it was around things like ESG, sustainability. ESG was quite important because I think when you are the VC for a bank, one of your priorities when you deal with startups is not just growth at all costs. Most sort of abide by that philosophy of like, oh, we have to move fast and break things. That whole Zuckerberg.
Don't like to break things because that represents
banks
risk.
hate that. And if you are a CVC for a bank that reports to a central bank, you're saying, here's how we're hedging our risk. Here's
so CVC, corporate VC, right?
We're covering our ass, and this is how we do it. So when we go in, and inevitably we'll make an investment with other VC funds, and there's always going to be one fund that says, okay, we're gonna figure out how to help this company grow as fast as possible. It's like, okay, great, you guys got that covered. While you guys manage the offense, you're going to score. We'll be the backfield. We're going to be the defenders. We're going to be the goaltenders. We're going to make sure that we don't succumb to any of the big risks that these startups might do, and a lot of it will be around governance. So. So governance was quite one of those areas that we were spending a lot of time thinking about and was neglected in VC. I also had a very strong interest in boosting the profile of women in VC and tech. Part of it's just because I've always been surrounded by strong women. I married a strong woman. I was, the son of a strong woman. And it's one of those things where when you have an ecosystem like Thailand, where it's very nascent, we can't afford to ignore half of our population. Like, if you're China and you've got a zillion people, then, you're never short of talent. But if you're a market of 70 million people, you need to leverage, your women and your men. So the whole side was quite important as well.
How did you get so you've talked a little bit about the sort of corporate social responsibility and so forth, but how did you get the bug for creating the current fund you have, which is a great. Well, you explain the fund you've got at the moment and how you and where did you get the drive for that?
Yeah, so I guess in trying to sort of beef up my understanding around ESG and sustainability, and the E as well. So understanding the environment side. I spent a lot of time just reading during the pandemic. I took a lot of online courses at Coursera. Really just methodically going down through each piece. So for E, I want to understand, resources. I want to understand extraction. I want to understand, carbon accounting. For S, I want to understand, race relations. I want to understand gender issues, and literally just methodically going piece by piece. And it was through the pandemic when I was approached by Gobi Partners, which is this institutional VC fund in the region, and they approached me and said, we want to launch an ESG practice, or we want to start implementing ESG process in what we do, and would you be interested in working with us and coming on board? And so I actually wound up doing that for 2.5 years as their head of ESG, and at one point realized that where I really wanted to start moving to was something a little bit more intimate. At that time, Gobi was already, well past 1 billion in assets under management. They had, 70 professionals. They covered across the region, which means that anything that I wanted to do that was thematic around either climate or gender was going to be a tough hill to climb when you're having to move like a super tanker that, may not want to move in the same direction. So, late last year, I was being courted by a woman who's wanted to launch a climate fund in Southeast Asia with a strong emphasis on gender, which was the intersection of all the things that I was kind of interested in at the time. And so earlier this year, I basically pulled the trigger and came on board and said, okay, I want to help, join you and a small group of people to build this fund so basically, I guess, develop an inclusive climate investment agenda, which meant that we're looking at climate and we wanted to make sure that women as both, entrepreneurs creating solutions, but also as stakeholders on the receiving end of those solutions are factoring into our investments.
Very cool. Well, at this point in the show, we like to do what we call the lightning round, which is I'm going to ask you some short, punchy questions. Just keep the answers short, just so people can get to know you a bit better.
Sure.
All right. So this is the lightning round. Okay, Paul. Let me ask you, what's the first time you can remember being exposed to science fiction?
Science fiction.
Either like a movie or book or something like that.
Probably, I think at a very early age, a lot in the movies. Actually, don't know, to be honest, probably it goes back to just Saturday morning cartoons.
Yeah.
It's probably just watching like Jetsons,
Yeah.
Super Friends.
Yeah.
I first got into it more proactively when I was in junior high, and I know it's supposed to be short and punchy, but I picked up my first science fiction novel that I really got into, which was Edgar Rice Burroughs' Princess of Mars, the first of the 11.
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah. And so that sort of touched off a lifelong love of science fiction, reading science fiction.
What did you think of John Carter, the Disney movie?
I disliked it.
Yeah, interesting.
I loved how they visualized it, but the storyline is just they Hollywoodified it.
Yeah, true.
To be honest, nowadays that would have made a great series.
Yes,
right?
yes. I agree. In fact,
you try to cram the entire ethos of it in 2 hours, it's not going to work. But if you were to create like you create a serial, which is like kind of like the old.
I get it.
Hollywood serials, and that would have been great in kind of a streaming format.
We're getting off the topic. All right, what technology do you think has most changed humanity?
Oh, most changed humanity. I guess in light of all the work I've been doing, it's probably a lot of the work around fertilizers and the green revolution.
Okay, cool. Very interesting. Is there a futurist or entrepreneur that has influenced you or being a mentor to you, and why have they been a positive influence?
You mean present company excluded?
Yeah, of course.
Because you're the only futurist that I really get to talk
Get to hang out with.
No, I don't know if there's any singular person. I think I'm an amalgamation of all the different incredible science fiction writers and thinkers that I kind of glom off of.
Sure. Is there a prediction that an entrepreneur or a futurist or a sci-fi practitioner has made that stands out to you as particularly prescient?
Ooh, wow. I don't know about an investor, but I always love to come back to the movie Minority Report, just because so much of it is starting to come true. So much of it looks like it is going to come true. And again, I haven't read the original Philip K. Dick work, so I don't know how much of Spielberg's vision was glommed off of the short story. Yeah. But so if it's mostly Spielberg, if it's different, then it's got to be Spielberg, right? It's or the writers who said this
he did definitely take license, but the core of the story is still there.
Yeah.
So on that, is there a science fiction story or a treatment you've read on the future that is most representative of the future you hope for?
Hope for? Well, if we're talking far future, I'd love to see something like Roddenberry's Star Trek, where we've ended war, at least on Earth, where we've ended poverty.
Money is gone. And
we've ended racism. Yeah. We've ended a lot of isms.
Yes. Yeah.
That's that. I think his vision of the future is probably the most pure and the most beautiful in terms of this is my optimistic view.
It's a very common answer, actually.
Yeah.
So. All right, well, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to The Futurists with myself, Brett King, and our guest this week is Paul Ark. And we'll be back right after this message from our sponsors. Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcasts, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific, and the FinTech 5. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network, and Next Gen Banker. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. Welcome back to The Futurists. I'm your host, Brett King. I'm here with Paul Ark. What is the name of your fund that you're running today, Paul?
The Radical Fund.
The Radical Fund. That suits your persona.
Well, we are. Well, I would say that we are taking a very radical approach, and by me, it's like, or we, it's like the rest of the team. So it's not just me.
So when we're looking out at the issues of climate, the debate on whether climate change is happening is sort of really over right now. And while there's still some debate over the extent by which mankind contributed to climate change, the requirement for adaptation, infrastructure resilience, food security, all of those issues that come from climate, as well as dealing with extreme weather events and the property damage and so forth that's going to come with it, relocation requirements, etc., mass immigration, all of these problems. How do you see that cycle developing? So when is it, do you think, that humanity is going to start to adjust priorities towards adaptation and mitigation?
Well, yeah, so it's a bit of a binary there, because I think if we think about climate, the easiest way to think about it is either in terms of mitigation or adaptation, either separately or operating in conjunction. But for those that are a little bit less climate oriented or don't work in the space, climate mitigation is basically focusing on how to prevent the world from getting warmer.
Right.
And a lot of that is around sort of energy transition. So how do we electrify our grids? How do we move away from fossil fuels to renewable energy? All in the way of sort of reducing carbon emissions, bringing down carbon in the atmosphere, and preventing the world from getting warmer. The flip side of that is adaptation, as you were talking about. So adaptation basically focuses on how do we deal with a warmer world. So if we were to go completely zero carbon emissions, like right now, and for some, we were able to wave a magical wand, we're now completely 100% renewable, and we're not emitting anything. It is still going to be a hotter world for the next, through our lifetimes.
Right.
Because to be able to bring down the amount of carbon that's already in the atmosphere, I think around 424 parts per million, down to a pre-industrial amount of about 250, is probably going to take anywhere between a few hundred years to maybe 1,000 plus years. So we are now, so everything that, so I tell people, 2023 in terms of record heat and droughts and once in a century climate disasters that are now once in a decade climate disasters.
And multiple cities dealing with 1 in 1,000 year flooding events.
Yes.
And so forth, right?
I said, as bad as 2023 is now, this is the best that it's ever going to be from now on. Because we can either hold the line or it's just going to get worse.
That's a great line.
Yeah, and it's depressing.
Yeah.
But if we take it as a given that we're going to live in a hotter world, how do we adapt? And I think you were mentioning how do we adapt in terms of food security. So if we've got a lot of seasonal variation, then now our ability to predict how much food we're able to produce becomes highly volatile. If we talk about things like hurricanes, floods, all these wild environmental events, then how do we build cities and communities that are more climate resilient? Both in terms of withstanding damage, but also how do we bounce back from damage? So, just every aspect, how do we adapt to that? So if we think about it in terms of those two binaries, we would think, okay, those are going to be equally important because, we do have to hold the line in terms of, it getting warmer. And we have to adjust to the fact that it is going to get warmer. Today, however, about 95-ish% of all investment in climate goes to mitigation. So we have not even thought about how do we deal with, the world going to, even if it doesn't go to hell in a handbasket, it's at least going to go to heck in a handbasket. Yeah. It's there. And we're not really spending the amount of money that we need in infrastructure, in building more resilient supply chains. We've seen what supply chains disruptions can look like during the pandemic. Yeah. All it takes is was it the Evergreen getting stuck in the
just one thing,
canal? And that set back, that did billions of dollars in damage. And so let's riff
on that. Let's riff on that a bit. Energy transition is a clear goal, but there's a lot of stuff that you talked about there in terms of trajectory and so forth. So I'm interested in, at what point because you talked about it's going to only get worse from here, and I'm on the same page as you on that front. But to the point where we have to mobilize considerable resources to do this, like I'm talking about double-digit percentage of global GDP, where there is broad social demand for this type of action, because we don't see that yet. We see a groundswell occurring, but we don't see mainstream pressure on politics and corporations yet to do this with a sense of urgency. There is directionally we're going the right way, but it's not happening fast enough. We're not going to hit the goals for the Paris Accord, and we know that at risk right now there is hundreds of millions of lives still at risk because we haven't taken the action we needed to do that. So, at what point does this become almost like a wartime effort? Do you think?
So I was waiting for you to either mention wartime effort or I was going to bring it up, because I think we treat climate, and especially in my space where we do tech investment, as if it were another technology that's in demand or to solve a problem. And so, and it's one of those things where in terms of consumer products and services, it's never this sort of globally mobilized effort like, hey, we're all going to globally mobilize our use of TikTok because it's important. It's like people, supply and demand, people have preferences, but climate is a crisis. It's not something like, do we want better ride-hailing services? Do we want food delivery? And this would be a nice-to-have service that adds to our lifestyle. For those that are very extreme in their views of climate, and I'm kind of increasingly getting to that point, is we are at war.
Yeah.
And I think if we look at what we're dealing with climate, we're dealing with an existential crisis that deals with our very existence.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're not only at war with the climate, but we're at war with ourselves.
With our own, sort of laissez-faire, blasé kind of view towards...
Or our philosophical view of the fact that the planet is here to serve our needs from a resource perspective and so forth, versus we need to live in harmony with the system. Right?
But I guess you can ask yourself, it's like if we look at, say, the U.S., in the 40s, at what point does the U.S. say we absolutely need to step into this war?
Right.
We see it going around us. It's impacting our daily lives, but Roosevelt is holding the line about entering the war until we have, Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
And so what is climate change's Pearl Harbor moment, where it's like, we can no longer stay out of this war. We have to tackle it. We have to mobilize resources. And it was a moment where not just the government, but the populace understood, okay, life now is forever changed. We're not going to go to the supermarkets and, consume at will. We're going to be sacrificing, we're going to need to, hoard, tin and rubber and iron. It's like we're going to have to make some real hard sacrifices, and we got to mobilize for this global effort. I do not think that we've had our Pearl Harbor moment, because we're still saying, oh yeah, and I think to your point, yeah, we could, we could use transition fuels. We're talking about abated versus unabated emissions at COP28. We are still sticking our heads in the sand, or maybe not most of the people that,
well, it's a
focus on it,
process
but
of negotiation right now, right? There's negotiation against the old system.
Yeah, and that would be the equivalent of saying, well, we're not going to war with Nazi Germany. We're negotiating our
diplomatic
involvement.
Solutions. Yeah.
So it's like diplomacy with tanks and guns and bombs, or we're going to call it a robust engagement, but we're not going to say we're at war. I mean, that's literally the equivalent of how we deal with climate change. Is we dance around it through semantics, and legalities, and it's not about, like, we can legalize it to hell.
So when do you think that Pearl Harbor moment might come? Like, is it 20 years from now? Is it sooner?
I think it's when we have I'd like to think it's when we have like a severe loss of life that affects one of the major G7 countries.
So major heat wave that kills a large percentage of
flooding. I'd say I'd like to think.
Okay.
But then we just went through COVID-19, and that was like, as it was happening and people were dying around us, we had deniers.
Yeah, I know.
So
so just a bit of water. It's only up to my knees. I don't need to move my house yet.
Yeah. So I'd like to think it happened. The cynical answer is, I think when most of the baby boomers have died off.
Yeah.
And Gen Z.
Yeah. Well, I think I think culturally Gen Z are going to.
They're more tuned
even
to it.
Millennials will have a very different view of policy, and
surveys show that there's as every successive generation is more attuned to climate because they're the ones that are feeling it.
Yeah. That makes sense. So all right, let's get really futuristic here. One of the things we like to do on the show is look out further in the future. So coming out the other side of this, in 20 or 30 years, let's say 2050s, right? We're in the 2050s. How do you think, what do you think we can expect in terms of adaptation? What is life going to be like? And how, what will the world look like in terms of this arena, in terms of climate mitigation and responses?
Okay, so I think if by 2050 we have not had that, what we're now started calling our Pearl Harbor moment, where the governments of the world have agreed that we need to coalesce around this issue, and if we're still sort of fussing around the edges,
it has to be by then. It has to.
Well, so the thing, but you have to. So if you look at where a lot of people in power now are.
Yeah.
You have a lot of tech billionaires that are now just building underground bunkers, right? They've literally just said, you know what, we potentially have the power to change things, but we're not going to. We're just gonna hunker down, bunker down.
Let's
we're gonna take care of
invest
ourselves.
in robot laser sentries.
And we're just going to take care of like our niche little club of fellow billionaires, which is basically saying let the other 98% of the world's population just it's like screw you guys and gals, or you have to fend for yourself. So if you look at that at a country level, if we have not mobilized around this issue by 2050, then it's going to be global north telling the global south, hey, good luck, folks. Maybe it'll be a lot cheaper to manufacture things because we don't have cheap labor from Bangladesh or Africa or wherever.
Factories and
but by that time it'll be automated anyway, so we really don't need the greater the bottom 70% of the world's population. So good luck. That's a very cynical kind of.
No, but it's possible.
But it's possible. It's very possible.
Yeah, I know.
And if again, I'd like to, as I said, I'd love to buy into that optimistic future that Roddenberry envisioned, and that we're all humans looking out for humanity. But in reality, it's like. People are self-interested and very corporate, and it's like,
it's capitalism. Can we reform capitalism enough?
Yeah, and that's the thing is, a lot of the stuff I've been like either in terms of podcasts or books lately are now saying that it's just thinking, and I've been tossing around in my head is that climate change is not just an unintended byproduct of capitalism. It is the end result of capitalism.
Like it is not a bug; it's a feature.
It's a feature. It's core. It's a core feature of.
On that, we agree.
So then the future. So I guess 2050. What is my vision of the future in 2050? It depends on what is our vision of what capitalism is or becomes. Because capitalism, in order for capitalism to work, you need the profit motive, which means ultra efficiency, which means you need something very extractive rather than circular.
Well, next week we're going to have Kim Stanley Robinson on the show. So it's great timing that you're on the show this week because it sort of sets the scene for his debates on this. But
that sounds very gloom and doom. Okay. And everyone I talk to says, you're just the most pessimistic person working in climate. And I said, anyone that thinks about it and thinks that, human nature's brutal and savage, a very Hobbesian sort of vision of humanity, and is still spending their time 9 to 5ing climate tech. It's like I'm not pessimistic. I'm just cynical. Anyone that works in climate finance and climate tech is inherently optimistic.
If you've been studying this for a decade plus and you're
still working, trying to make the world a better place, it means that you could be as cantankerous as all you want, but you're still at the core an optimist. So for anyone that's
because you wouldn't be trying to change things unless you want a better future.
I'm not a defeatist.
What are the worst aspects of climate change we can expect in the 2050s if we don't do enough? What could the world look like, so that people get an idea why they should be getting behind this?
Well, I hope it's nothing like Mad Max Fury Road, because that's a very bleak looking future. But it's not.
But food rationing like we had during wartime?
Absolutely. I think, we're going to look at a world, especially if we haven't really tried to go down the massive geoengineering route. Because once we go geoengineering, that's really going to do some kind of funky psychedelic
very
things.
Experimental.
That's going to be funky. So assuming that we don't completely try to alter the planet through geoengineering, we're going to definitely look at a lot less green space. I don't think we're going to make the switch over to alternative proteins fast enough. So either we're going to be deforesting at a greater rate so that we can kind of create enough protein based on beef and pork and all the things that people don't want to give up.
Farming.
Which means that the natural world is just going to be a bit of a hellscape. We're going to lose a lot of green area. Water is actually, I think water is going to be probably one of the hugest geopolitical flashpoints over the next couple of decades.
Look at the Colorado River and so forth.
Yeah, Colorado River. Hindu Kush is probably going to be an incredible flashpoint. We're already starting to see a lot of problems in like Ethiopia. All the conflicts that are happening in that part of Africa is all around. The mega dam that Ethiopia is building, and it's all basically trying to control water resources for the next half century. And so,
all right, well, we can't end the podcast on a negative note. We need to end it on something positive. So I guess I shouldn't have taken us down that path if I wanted something positive. But I'm also we share similar views on this front. But having said that, 30 years away, there's a lot of tech that is going to be really positive for mankind. So what do you think are the areas where we will have made significant improvements, and what will the future bring that makes you optimistic?
Well, let me tweak the question slightly, and this will be a nice segue into your next week's podcast with Kim Stanley Robinson. Because obviously you can't deal with tech without thinking about Elon Musk, whether you love him or hate him. And one of the big things that's on his mind is, let's go to Mars. And a lot of cynics are like, well, why do you want to terraform Mars if we can't even kind of terraform our own planet? And I think in a lot of ways, what he's trying to do does make sense, in the sense that any technology that we would do around terraforming would hopefully be applicable to some extent to our own planet. So if we can kind of make Mars a more habitable planet, then we can actually, it doesn't have to be either or. We can use the same tech here. And then I guess it's just the belief that whether we need to be kind of a two planet species or more for that 10,000 year horizon.
For the insurance policy.
So I think, the question becomes, if we need to look at terraforming as a concept, not just to terraform Mars, but to make now the U.S. atmosphere and the U.S., the atmosphere more inhabitable, the soil more fertile, the whole plethora of technologies that would fall under quote unquote terraforming. What should we be developing? What
Building
could we be developing?
Defenses
Sure, and it gets back to your lightning round question about one of the biggest technologies that I thought was instrumental was around the development of modern fertilizers, which basically increased crop yields and fed the planet. Now we're at that crisis point where fertilizers no longer cut it; they've kind of reached the end of their natural usefulness. It's sort of like the agricultural equivalent of Moore's law.
Right.
After you hit that theoretical limit, how do we jump onto that next S curve? So how do we feed the planet when fertilizers are no longer effective? And you figure that out, then you probably answered a piece around terraforming.
Right.
So I would like to say any of those technologies, under that broad umbrella, are going to be absolutely vital. And I think, again, thinking about next week, I love the Mars series, the red Mars, blue Mars, green Mars. So, and a lot of Kim Stanley Robinson's books.
Ministry for the Future as well. It's like you talking about the Pearl Harbor event in that book. He has a Pearl Harbor event,
chapter 1,
the heat wave in India. Yeah,
chapter 1. And so I it's never. I don't think it's ever going to be one technology. I think a lot of people are like, what's that one technology? But climate is a very complex systemic issue, which is going to require really a buffet of a variety of different technologies to sort of pull it off. And so anything that's sort of how do we reclaim our environment?
What size workforce do you think is needed for this?
Okay, so I can kind of give kind of the clever, pithy answer that I firmly, when I talk about my work in Climate VC, the one thing I love to tell people is everything is climate. In the sense that all the work we do has a climate impact, whether we explicitly think it does or not. And so if you are a banker working in corporate finance, you could be doing work that says, how do we think about modeling and risk around financing sustainable technologies? If you work in agriculture, how do we make agriculture more regenerative? If you work in fashion, how do we make fashion more circular? So theoretically, it should be a workforce of 7 billion people, meaning that wherever you are in the world and whatever business you work in, we need to start thinking about it in terms of sustainability. Like so yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that. Or I guess by the time it really matters, we're a workforce of 8 to 10, depending on where projections are in world population by 2050.
Well,
8 to 12.
Yeah, it's going to stall at some point, but and food scarcity is going to be a factor in that. But all right, dude. Well, listen, it's been fantastic to have you on the podcast. Yeah. For people listening and they're interested in what you're doing at Radical and following you and your work, how can people stay in touch with you, and where can they find more information about you?
Well, if they want to reach out to me, they can, I can be found on LinkedIn at Paul Ark, and they'll see like this really long Thai name. Granted, I think sometimes I get a lot of inbound requests to look at startups, so sometimes it takes me a while to get through the inbox. If anyone that's interested in the Radical Fund could look at our website. If you give me a moment, I can never remember the URL, so my CEO is probably going to kill me. It is www.theradicalfund.com. Okay, so nothing too complex there. And if they see a lot of purple on the website, that's us. That's our color. But
fantastic. Well, Paul Ark, thanks for joining us on The Futurists. And as we like to say, we will see you in the future.
Thanks for having me, Brett.
Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.